Hello, welcome to episode 73 for APUSH. Today we're talking about the effects of the Spanish-American War, and this is the slide that we ended on in episode 72, was this great quote, great, as in it tells the whole story, this great quote from John Hay about the Spanish-American War. It has been a splendid little war, begun with the highest motives, carried on with the magnificent intelligence and spirit favored by that fortune which loves the brave. And you know, as every war ends, so there must be a treaty. And here you see the front page of the New York Journal from February of 1899 saying that the peace treaty is ratified, but then right under it, awful slaughter. It's this interesting juxtaposition, and a lot of it has to do with the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1899. Unfortunately for you, this is the third Treaty of Paris. There's the Treaty of Paris of 1763 that ended the French and Indian War, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that ended the American Revolution, and now the Treaty of Paris of 1899 that ended the Spanish-American War. And the terms of the treaty are pretty significant for the United States as far as becoming an international power. As you see there at the bottom, it ushered in a more vigorous international foreign policy. Ushered in a new direction, not a new, but a more significant direction in terms of imperialism. And that's because the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1899, showed that the United States had become a global empire, gained Puerto Rico, gained Guam, which I think is maybe right here, and gained the Philippines. All three acquired from Spain as part of the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1899. And so with that acquisition came this, as you'll see, one of the after effects of the Spanish-American War is a renewed conflict, this time not with Spain, but with the Filipinos, who had assumed that the United States would grant them the freedom they had been fighting for as well. I think we had talked that Spain had been facing rebellions, not just from the Cubans leading up to the Spanish-American War, but from the Filipinos as well. And so you're going to see one of the after effects of the Spanish-American War is the United States acquires the Philippines, but then they acquire the revolution in the Philippines as well. And that is part of the reason this was such a controversial treaty. You might go 57-27, wow, you know, that's an overwhelming support for this treaty, but really, you know, you needed 2/3 for this treaty, and this really only passed by one vote. And part of that was that Americans were like, "Oh, wait, we were a colony of Great Britain, and fought Great Britain for our independence 100 years earlier. Are we really going to become a country that denies independence to people who seek it?" So let's go ahead and get into some of the effects. One of the first is, right at the exact same time that the Treaty of Paris of 1899 is being ratified, John Hay is issuing what are called the open door notes. And these are two different notes. Number one, the determination that there should be free trade and access to all Chinese ports. If you remember from World Civ and the map that you're looking at here, there were spheres of influence in China. China hadn't been taken over completely. It's just its ports had been had been dominated by certain countries. You see up in the north, Port Arthur by Russia, a bunch of Russian ports actually up in the north, Vladivostok, actually that's in Russia, but Dairen, Port Arthur. Then Portugal has Macau, Hong Kong to Britain, Kai Chau Bay to Germany, Kwangchaoan to France, and I apologize for my pronunciation of those. And the United States was basically coming late to the game, and they're saying, hey, look, we have freedom of trade anywhere in China. And at the same time, then another open door note as created by the Boxer Rebellion was that the United States would help support Chinese independence, that there should be a country that controls China. And really, most countries didn't want to try to control China because it was too big. So you stuck with these ports, and that really spoke to a new type of imperialism, an imperialism that didn't need to take over a country physically, but just needed to control its economies. So one effect is the open door policy. Now we go back and we look at this and you say, well, Mr. Williams, you mentioned the Filipino War, and really at the exact same time that the Boxer Rebellion and the open door policy are going on. And here you see Uncle Sam saying, we're going to prevent China, whether it from being under foreign control, whether that's from an internal rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, or whether that's from other countries trying to take over China. And at the same time this is going on, this is when the Filipino War starts. And shown on the left is William McKinley, who said he struggled at night, walked the floors of the White House wondering what he should do with this conundrum, as shown in the image on the right, where he's staring at the map of the Philippines, and that justice and really Lady Liberty is showing him the death and destruction going on in the Philippines. And he says he walked the floors of the White House at night wondering what to do, and there was only one thing to do, and that was to take the Philippines and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. And then he says he went to bed and slept soundly. And so thus began the Filipino conflict, a 4-year war where the Spanish-American War had only been a 3-month war, a 4-year war with a decidedly technologically, numerically inferior opponent, but an opponent that was fighting for their freedom. And so it is really a massive hypocrisy and irony that the United States is fighting to keep another country from being free. Now, why would they do that? Let's go back and look at this map. And there you see down in the bottom of the map, bottom middle, you see the Philippines kind of popping up right by China. Well, if you're going to want access to the Chinese trade, the Philippines is a great kind of dropping or jumping off point to that. So, the United States is saying we're taking the Philippines to uplift, Christianize, and civilize them, when in reality, you're probably taking them because of the strategic geographic presence that it affords the United States in the Eastern Pacific. That said, the Filipino conflict, as we said, raged from 1899 to 1903. It was really one of the first guerrilla conflicts, meaning kind of an informal, not informal, but not your typical war. Kind of like, the American colonists fought a guerrilla war in the American Revolution. That meant that not everyone was wearing uniforms. Atypical strategies were employed, meaning, hiding or sneak attacks, things like that. And here you see another stereoscope of one of the issues of the Filipino War that made it such a difficult war for the United States to quote unquote win was a lack of knowledge of the terrain. This is a jungle war. The United States had never fought an international war, had never really fought in a jungle, had never really fought a guerrilla war except when they were fighting it themselves. And so I do want to share with you a video clip from a PBS documentary called America 1900, and it's a snapshot of America in the year 1900 and how much was going on. And one of the things going on was the Filipino War. So with that said, let's go ahead and watch the video clip. And what I want you to think about as you watch it is, what were some of the difficulties the United States would encounter that help explain why this war would be so long?
The president had hoped the Filipinos would willingly become part of the new American empire. But the Filipinos were ready to die for the right to govern themselves. For years, they had fought the Spanish. Now they were prepared to fight the Americans, if they had to. In January 1899, they established the Philippine Republic. By 1900, Americans were fighting a guerrilla war 7,000 miles from home.
For the United States to maintain this empire, what the United States had to do was to use force and to project that force across thousands and thousands of miles. We had never done that. And we were now involved in civilizations, such as the Philippines, with which we had very little acquaintance. And it was a question whether or not Americans were really that good an imperialist in order to pull this off. This was an extremely brutal war that the United States and the Filipinos fought. Americans looked down on the Filipinos as people who were uncivilized. The term gook originated in the Philippine insurrection. We looked at this as essentially a superior power fighting an inferior people who deserved their inferiority because they had not been able to organize their society, they had not been able to uplift themselves, as McKinley liked to say. The United States was willing to use very brutal force in order to bring the Filipinos around. One soldier's letter, for example, relates how one of his comrades, an American soldier, had been found murdered outside this village with his stomach slit open. And the American commander immediately orders that everyone in this Filipino village be executed. And according to this young man who wrote home, there were 1,000 men, women, and children who were executed in this reprisal for the murder of this one American soldier. This was a no-holds-barred war between the Filipinos and the Americans. And by 1900, many Americans are beginning to wonder whether even all of the possible profits that this empire might offer were worth this kind of brutality.
As more and more American boys lost their lives, anti-war sentiment was growing. Many saw the war against a people seeking independence as a monstrous perversion of American ideals. Multi-millionaire industrialist Andrew Carnegie, a leader of a small but important anti-imperialist movement, asked, "Is it possible that the American Republic is to be the suppressor of the Philippines' struggle for independence?" Carnegie offered to buy the Philippines for $20 million and set the island nation free. All through the winter of 1900, Americans read of devastation and horror half a globe away. Time and again, they were assured that the war was all but over. But native spies reported that thousands of Philippine insurgents were plotting to rise up against American forces in Manila. That a stash of bombs and munitions were hidden in a house in the center of that city. That rebels were massing in the provinces. McKinley had been told by his generals that they could subdue their barefoot opponents with 20,000 men. Then the generals asked the president for 20,000 more. But 40,000 soldiers were not enough. By 1900, 60,000 American troops were on the ground in the Philippines. And the War Department was calling for another 2 divisions. McKinley knew that his chances in the November election could hinge on a war he didn't want to fight and didn't know how to win.
Okay, so you get a real idea, I hope, of some of the difficulties, not just the terrain, but the distance, the cause of the opponent, the fact that all Americans weren't behind the war. All of these things can make any war difficult to fight or win. It doesn't matter which country's doing it. And a lot of those things that you just heard as problems we face, the United States faced in the Filipino conflict, will be repeated in the Vietnam War. Will be the same things that the United States has difficulties with in the Vietnam War. And so this guerrilla conflict, this idea of a terrain and a people and culture that you're not familiar with, really can also be seen in this stereoscope. I mean, how difficult is it to fight wars in places like this where the man in the rice paddy could have a weapon. And the minute you walk by him, you could get shot. You heard that Americans were willing to do brutal things, which led to even more anti-war. And you can see here that the copyright is 1900. At the start of the video clip, you heard that the Filipinos declared independence in January of 1899. In February of 1899, the United States acquires the Philippines, which is why the whole conflict starts. The third effect, once you get Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, by this point has just been annexed as well, this desire for a way to cut the distance of travel is important. And this is an image of the USS Oregon as it was ordered into war in Cuba in 1898, and it left Seattle, went around through the Strait of Magellan, which is at the bottom of South America, and by the time it got to Cuba, the war was over. And so this is something we're going to talk about in its own episode. So we're going to skip the whole story of acquiring the canal and move on to topic number 4. So that is quite a long topic. And topic number 4 is the Platt Amendment gets passed. So another after effect of the Spanish-American War, the United States had said in 1898 when they declared war on Spain that we had no desire to acquire Cuba. And they said so in the Teller Amendment of 1898. But the Platt Amendment of 1902 basically said that any change that the Cubans wanted to make to their constitution had to be approved by US Congress first. And also that the United States would acquire a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which we still have, which is really odd that the United States has a naval base in a communist country. The Castro regime tried to basically push the United States off of this base by cutting off the water supply, but the United States responded by creating the first real desalination plant at Guantanamo. So the United States gets its water at Guantanamo, not from the island of Cuba, but from the ocean. So the Platt Amendment and this kind of more stringent control over areas within America's sphere of influence is another effect. And that leads us really to topic 5, which is longer. And it is this, the Platt Amendment is this first kind of shot of, well, really open door policy is the first shot, but the open door policy doesn't have really a component of American involvement in it. It's an American statement, whereas the Platt Amendment is American involvement. And a lot of this new foreign policy that comes out of the Spanish-American War has a massive hint of white man's burden. As you see here, Uncle Sam holding up his end, and he's got Cuba in the upper right, Hawaii on top of his head, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and I can't really read what that is. It looks like it says Ladrone, but I don't know what that might be. And so it's John Bull, which is a British symbol, says it's really most extraordinary what training will do. Why, only the other day I thought the man unable to support himself. And here he is, Uncle Sam, the United States, upholding and helping uplift and civilize and Christianize these heathens. But really, that's just the public justification for the new foreign policy. You know what the real justification is: economic power, economic might. Acquiring the Philippines allows you to issue the open door policy. The Spanish-American War creates a sphere of influence in the Caribbean, which leads the United States to declaring the Platt Amendment. And that's not enough. The United States under Teddy Roosevelt, when the Platt Amendment was adopted, named after, I believe, Thomas Collier Platt of New York, Roosevelt issues his own corollary or his own foreign policy statement, which is an addition or a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, in which he basically says, the Monroe Doctrine split the world into 2 spheres. The Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence, but it didn't say what we would do to uphold that. The Roosevelt Corollary declared a right of intervention to keep the Western Hemisphere stable. So whether that's intervention to keep Europe out, or whether that's intervention to keep things in order among the countries in South America or in the Western Hemisphere. So here you see Santo Domingo, Cuba, Mexico, Panama, I think that says Venezuela. And here you see the United States under Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick diplomacy, speak softly but carry a big stick, using the US Navy to make sure that things are stable. And here you see there is the idea of keeping Europe out of Western Hemisphere affairs, but here you see the idea that the United States would also do things just to keep the Western Hemisphere stable. So really both parts of the Roosevelt Corollary are shown here. The Roosevelt Corollary quickly gives way to dollar diplomacy, which was a statement by the Taft administration that one way we would intervene was economically to keep things stable. So whether that is foreign investment or in US investment in foreign countries, or whether that is US occupation to make sure that the economies of these South and Central and Caribbean republics are stable. And you see the massive, massive amounts of US intervention, whether that's possession of Puerto Rico, the purchase of the Virgin Islands, the occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934, the occupation of the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924. There's the Platt Amendment and Guantanamo, the US seizure of Veracruz, US occupation of Cuba over several times, Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala. It's kind of mind-boggling how many places the US was involved, and a lot of these were through economics. So if you look at Guatemala and you look specifically at Guatemala and you see it says fruit company, it should say United Fruit Company, the banana trade. You know, United States companies owned land in foreign countries, owned the Panama Canal, as we'll learn. And so a lot of that was, as Taft said, you know, dollar diplomacy, you're substituting dollars for bullets. We don't need to fight. We just need to invest and create peace that way. That also means later that the United States needs to be sure that the Monroe Doctrine isn't just about Europe. By this point, Japan is becoming a power. And so Henry Cabot Lodge issues his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that says the United States isn't just worried about European intervention, but all people's intervention. He says, resolve that when any harbor or other place in the American continents is so situated that the occupation thereof for naval or military purposes might threaten the safety of the United States, we will intervene. You know, the United States cannot look upon that without grave concern. And here you see the cartoon that led to it was, you know, Uncle Sam looking at Mexico, specifically Magdalena Bay, and seeing, a fisherman, I wonder if he knows that this land is posted. And you look at the fisherman and it's not a Mexican, but it's a Japanese soldier. And it says, keep off the Monroe Doctrine. And the United States is saying, get out. So really it was this worry that a Japanese company was trying to get involved in Baja California, specifically a bay in Baja California called Magdalena Bay. The United States was doing that in the Pacific, but we didn't want anyone to do it close to us. And so that's why you see Uncle Sam saying get. And that leads finally to another expression of foreign policy by Woodrow Wilson, which again is really masked under the guise of white man's burden, under the guise of really we're here to make sure that the Western Hemisphere is held to a moral standard. We can't abide by dictators or thugs in control of countries. As he said, and we saw here under dollar diplomacy, that the United States had been involved in Mexico during the Wilson presidency. Really, his moral diplomacy was about Mexico. Mexico had been going through a revolution, overthrowing Porfirio Diaz, leading to a series of leaders who the United States didn't approve of because they weren't sympathetic to US interests in Mexico, not because they were good leaders. And so Woodrow Wilson declares, I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men. And really, they didn't elect good men, they just elected men who would do the US bidding. And you can see this moral diplomacy in his statement, war speech that for World War I, that our aim was to make the world safe for democracy. You see that in his issuing of the 14 points, which included a League of Nations. A lot of that should be reviewed, and we'll be going over that later. And you see that the cartoon is saying, it's not really making a foreign policy statement. It's saying that, again, we can be hypocritical. We can say we're making the world safe for democracy, but in our own country at this point, we're not allowing women the right to vote. America, the land of the free, but there you see the American woman is shackled behind that, kept out of sight. And so really a lot of what you're seeing is the United States entering the world stage and being able on the world stage to say one thing out of one side of the mouth and then act in a completely opposite way. We're going to make the world safe for democracy, but not for you, Cuba, and not for you, the Philippines. And we're going to say things that make us look good, but in reality, we're really worried about American economics on the global stage. And if you think about it, everything we've talked about was really leading to that. But you're not going to admit that because that doesn't actually sound good. Our next episode, we're going to go back and we're going to talk specifically about the way the United States acquired what will be called the Panama Canal.